Okay, I left the microphones to the convener, the other convener, Professor Alfredo Di Filippo.
Thanks, Stefan, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Stefan Schnitzer. Some of you already knew him in our classes. And Stefan is a professor in the US at the Marquette University and is also a research associate to the Smithsonian Tropica Research Institute in Barro Colorado in Panama, which is the main institute of research studying tropical ecology in the world. We met some years ago, I don't remember how many, but some years ago, and we established a cooperation because I was very interested in studying his studies. He's interested in methods in applied ecology to understand tropical forest dynamics, and especially he's a big expert in lianas. What is the biology and ecology of this kind of plant structures and form these lianas, no? And together we found here we are cooperating on studying some of the exceptional lianas that we have. He will show you beautiful examples of what he's studying there in Panama. But we found very interesting examples of liana in Italy during warm temperate forests, like those in Gargano National Forest, those UNESCO forests, but even here in Monticimini and Rio Romano, we found very, very big and exceptional examples of these plants that are, let's say, neglected here, because they are very rare and generally foresters have continually cut these lianas in our forests, but they exist. We found monumental ones, large, like 20 to 25 centimeters in diameter, and as old as 90 or 100 years. So we have here, and we found with Stefan these amazing plants. They are living on the same tree for 90 years, 100 years, without killing the tree. So there are very, very intriguing aspects of our environment, of ecology. But I will leave to Stefan now the lead of this talk. We want also say that we are trying also to establish some kind of international cooperation with Panama and with the States on this project, in his work, in these laboratories he has, and his forest is working in Panama. So maybe we will be able to find some way of exchanging students and do some field work together, researchers and students in the next years, hopefully, to go to Panama and see these forests that we are seeing now. So thanks, Stefan, for taking us.
Here, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alfredo and Stefano, for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Alfredo said, we're always looking for students to join us in our work, pursue doctorate degrees, and if you're interested, let me know or let Alfredo know, and we can explore these ideas. So it's a very interesting series of talks today, from agribusiness to vector and disease ecology of agricultural systems. And today, I'm going to talk about tropical forests in a changing climate. So we know tropical forests are incredibly important in ecosystems. More than 50% of the species in the world live in tropical forests, even though tropical forests cover less than 10% of the land mass. So you can find these kinds of figures all over the place, where in the tropics you also have the highest diversity of almost everything, right? I mean, this one's for vascular plants. Most of the diversity is in the tropics. Vertebrates, invertebrates, we always find really, really high diversity in tropical ecosystem. And these ecosystems are also incredibly important for carbon uptake, carbon storage. So why is that important? You know why that's important, right? So we have this problem of increasing carbon dioxide in the air. Tropical forests play an enormous role by pulling carbon out of the air, storing it in the forest. It can be measured a lot of different ways. Net primary productivity is highest in the tropics, pulling carbon out of the air, reducing atmospheric CO2. So primary productivity is how much carbon is being pulled out of the air. Storage of carbon is how much carbon is actually sequestered and kept in the tropical forest. So the critical environments for conserving most of the carbon that we find in tropical forests are stored in trees. You know, this whole giant tree trunk is all carbon. Pulling in this carbon, these trees can live for many hundreds of years. And so these forests slowly pull in the carbon and then they release it when they die or when they're cut down. And so there's these enormous trees in tropical forests that are storing carbon. You know, these are regular sized people, very large trees. But currently we have a forest degradation crisis, right? We're losing tropical forests. You can see that the red areas are the loss of tropical forests. And most of these losses are due to illegal logging and legal logging. It's very common to see in tropical forests where trees are being extracted, leaving these very degraded areas. Sometimes it looks like this, and then of course they become very dry and they easily burn. And it takes a very long time for these systems to recuperate after logging, depending on how they log. Mining is also becoming a very large problem in the tropics, really catastrophic for the landscape. But you know this, right? I mean, people have been publishing these papers for decades now. What seems to be overlooked in many cases is what's happening in these really large tracts of pristine tropical forests, right? We still have a lot of tropical forests. And with climate change, you know, the increase in temperatures is not uniform across the globe. You know, most of the temperature changes are happening at the poles, where you're getting 4 or 5 degrees Celsius changes, losing the glaciers, losing the ice, rising sea levels. We all know this, and people used to think that the tropics are relatively stable. Temperature changes are fairly small, right? And so this led to this belief that tropical forests were largely buffered from climate change. So we have these vast expanses of intact forests, very, very minimum contact with humans. I mean, there are indigenous groups that live here, but they don't destroy the forest in a large scale. And so you can find examples of this. And one of the questions we're interested in is, are pristine tropical forests changing? One of the biggest structural changes to pristine tropical forests is this increase in lianas. Now, for those of you who are at my lecture on Wednesday, sorry, I'm going to have to review a few things for the new people. But the new people are probably saying, what are lianas? Okay, lianas are these woody vines, very common in tropical forests. You see them congregating around trees. On tropical forests, snaking around in the understory, but they actually are climbing up to the canopy where they deploy their leaves above those of the host tree. And of course, you all know what these lianas are because you have them here. Grape, Rictus is a liana. Alfredo studies Hedera, which is very common here, and Clematis, which is also common here. And just a couple of facts and figures about lianas in the tropics. They're very, very abundant. From 10 to 40% of every woody stem that's rooted in the forest is one of these lianas in a typical lowland tropical forest. For example, on Barro Colorado Island in central Panama, 28% of the woody stems are these vines and 35% of the species. They're very diverse. The diversity per hectare is about 75 species, which is very high. We have a total of 180 species just on Barro Colorado Island, which is a fairly small island. Taxonomically, they're very diverse. They belong to many plant families. Over 170 plant families have some sort of climbing liana type species. They compete intensely with trees, so they reduce tree growth. And I'll show you some evidence for this that we've been collecting over the years. And they influence animal communities quite a bit. We'll talk about that. So 20 years ago, a paper was published in Nature, and it was a very interesting paper because Oliver Phillips and his colleagues had these long-term data sets from a botanist that had been collecting data around the world. And Oliver Phillips went out and re-measured some of the plots and wrote this paper about how lianas were increasing in tropical forests. And this is really interesting because there's no theoretical reason to suspect that lianas would be increasing in these forests. And because of that, nobody was really studying that. There were essentially no large-scale, long-term data sets to evaluate this finding other than this finding. And this finding was based on a lot of very small plots, 0.1 hectare to 1 hectare plots spread out across the world. And it was very intriguing. And it was a significant find. Nobody knew whether really to believe it or not. It looked to be true. And so in 2006, we began to collect long-term data on beyond the Barro Colorado Island. So just a review, this is South America, Central America. Panama is this little green country that joins South America to Central and North America. And you can see here is Panama City. Panama Canal runs through central Panama. And I will take you to Barro Colorado Island, which is right here. It's a nature reserve. There's no evidence of large-scale human interaction with this forest. So it's old, very old forest, at least 500 or 600 years old, probably much older. And in the center of this island, there's a monitoring plot. It's 50 hectares. So it's 1 kilometer by half a kilometer. And in 1980, they established this, and they started to follow the trees. They were following something like 240,000 trees, all trees greater than 1 centimeter in diameter, which is about that big. And they've been following them since 1980. So they do a census every 5 years. But lianas had never been done, and so we had started to collect data on the lianas on this 50 hectare plot. So for every liana on the plot, we put a tag on like this. We measured the diameter. We put a mark on at the diameter point, and we went through and started to tag every plant in the forest in this 50 hectare plot, right? And so after a year or so of sweating in the forest with a field crew of about 15 people, and we were able to come up with this map of all the lianas in this plot. So this is in 2007. And we found 67,000 rooted stems, right? So we knew exactly where they were, we knew their diameter, we were able to map them. And then we did the same thing 10 years later, 2017. So here's the 2017 map. Did they increase? What do you think? More, less, more? It's a little bit hard to tell. But in fact, they increased enormously. So we confirmed exactly what this earlier paper suggested, but at a much larger scale. And the increase was pretty stunning, actually. It was about 30% over 10 years. Now this is so on the purple bars on the far side, this is 2007 and 2017, and we divided it into recruitment, which means the new individuals that came in to the community. Persistent, meaning the ones that were there in 2007, we remain in 2017, and then mortality. And you can see there was actually a lot of mortality. We lost about 30,000 of the original stems, but we gained 50,000 new stems, right? We'll just ignore this part for now. This kind of change in tropical forests is, it's not sustainable. I mean, if this continued, we would have 1 million young stems in 50 years, right? So this rate cannot continue to increase. So somehow it's going to have to plateau. We also found that the size of lianas were increasing. So the basal area was also increasing. And 75% of the species had increased. 25 actually decreased a little. So 75% of the species are increasing. And what we really wanted to know here is why. Why are lianas increasing in this forest? Because that will probably tell us why they're increasing throughout the tropics. So as I told you on Wednesday, lianas are very responsive to disturbance. This is a map of, this is a LiDAR-based map of the canopy height of the forest. The red areas are very low high disturbance areas, represent where the tree died. And the green areas are very tall forest, right, over 40 meters. And so if you look at that next to the liana map, you can say, well, they actually correspond really, really well, and we can superimpose these maps and use a lot of spatial statistics, which I won't bore you with at this point, but almost all the species have a very strong adherence to disturbance, right? So they like it when trees die. And what's happening around the world in tropical forests is many, many trees are dying. We have an increase in tree mortality. This is some sort of climate change driven phenomenon that seems to be happening in these pristine tropical forests, happening in temperate forests as well. And so we want to test this idea, which seems pretty obvious, that increasing tree mortality is a likely explanation for this big change that we find in tropical forests. So we take, we can take this map, this stem map, we can divide it into lots of different quadrants, right? These are 20 by 20 meter quadrants. In this 50 hectare plot, there's 1,250 of them. And then we can classify them into very distinct categories to test this disturbance hypothesis. One is high disturbance, no disturbances in high canopy forest. There's no disturbance there. And compare that with these low disturbed areas that seem to not be generating very, very rapidly, new disturbance, and then old disturbance, right? And then we compare liana increases in these different categories to test this idea. And what we find is pretty clear. In the disturbed areas, these three, this is where almost all the liana increase happens, right? Now, it is also where a lot of the mortality happens, but the mortality can't balance the very, very strong increase. And so when you look at the net change, the others are following disturbance, and they're increasing in these increasingly disturbed areas. That seems to be what's happening. Now there is some increase in undisturbed forests too. And what that suggests is that there's other factors that are also pushing lianas up in abundance. Right. And so what the most likely factors are elevated drought and seasonality. This seems to be one of the big climate change ramifications or results. As I told you on Wednesday, lianas like these fairly dry seasonal places, and when the dry seasons start to become a little bit longer, lianas are probably going to benefit, and trees may actually decrease in abundance, and that seems to be happening. Elevated temperature really has the same effect. Just makes it a little bit drier, a little bit hotter. Elevated CO2, it might be pushing lianas a little faster than trees, but we don't have evidence for that. And elevated nutrient is one of the, pollution with industry and pollution. You tend to get a lot more nutrient deposition, a lot of nitrogen coming down in the air and the rainfall. We haven't found any evidence at all that that's increasing the liana. Okay, so why do we care? What are the implications for increasing lianas? Well, lianas climb trees, right? That's what they do. Very small lianas are climbing these big canopy trees. And they're putting their leaves above that of the tree. So you can see here that this is at the forest canopy level. I took these photos from one of the canopy cranes that we use to take physiological measurements. And almost all the leaves you see there are liana leaves, with just a few tree leaves poking up above the canopy. So lianas are having a really large effect on trees. They're covering these trees above ground. You don't normally get to see this unless you're outside the forest or in the lake, in this case. And by doing so, they're probably reducing tree growth and survival, which leads to reduced carbon emissions, right? So this is the idea we want to test. And we tested this just south of Barro Colorado Island in a place called Stefan Schnitzer, where we set up 16 plots. These plots were 60 by 60 meters. There were 8 that we designated as liana removal plots, and 8 were control plots. Then we put a 10-meter buffer around all of them. So really they're 80 by 80 meters, almost a full hectare of liana removal. Because lianas don't just grow up, they grow over the tree. So we wanted to make sure that these were truly liana removal comparisons. And in this experiment, we're following more than 30,000 trees, everything greater than 1 centimeter in diameter, has a tag, we know the diameter, we know where it's located. And we set this up in 2008. Then we did another full census, 2011, and then we cut all of the lianas in half the plots. And then in those plots, we went back and we continued to cut them. And this is what it looks like when you go to a tropical forest and you cut the lianas. You go from a tropical forest to a temperate forest. Not quite, but it looks that way. This is a tropical forest. This is a tropical forest with no lianas. Okay. Here's another example of that, where this is pre-cut and then we cut all the lianas. And you can see there's quite a big difference of light penetration into the forest. The lianas at the top of the canopy immediately started to die, right? Which is what you'd expect. And if you see those bright green leaves, the trees responded within days. The trees started putting out leaves immediately, which was pretty stunning. And we measured, since this was such a big experimental manipulation, we measured everything we could in this plot. We measured how light responded, because light, as we talked about on Wednesday, is very limiting in tropical forests. And before the cut, the light levels in the control plots and the removal plots were identical. When we cut the lianas, light increased by about 20%, which is quite a bit. So that's kind of our baseline now of how much light lianas attenuate or block. But then the trees started to respond, right? So when the lianas are gone, the trees start putting out more branches and they start creating a lot more leaves. So they begin to compensate for the loss of lianas. And 4 years into the experiment, the trees had fully compensated. Light levels dropped back down to the original level. We also examined how trees were responding immediately to the liana cutting. So we put these sap flow sensors into many dozens of trees, I think 108 trees at one point. We are following their immediate performance response. So what these things do is they measure the rate of flow of water through a plant. And it's a good proxy for plant performance, right? Are they growing or are they not growing? If they're not growing, they're not moving a lot of water, right? If they're growing, they're moving a lot of water. And so we had the forest, we had wires strung throughout the forest. We had to lock our data loggers in these barrels so they wouldn't be stolen. And it mostly worked. I mean, it was a big enterprise because we had to carry batteries throughout the forest. So imagine carrying batteries in this forest. It's quite an endeavor. What we found is this: almost immediately after cutting lianas, sap velocity went up, and that's the white bar there. Those are the liana removal trees. So you cut lianas, and some of the trees immediately start moving more water. They're photosynthesizing more, they're fixing more carbon, right? We cut them in the dry season. Once the rains came, what we call the intermediate season, this effect started to go away. And then during the full-on wet season, where it's raining nearly every day, there was no effect at all. And what this tells us is that, first of all, lianas have a very strong competitive effect. And that competitive effect really hurts trees during dry season. The previous to this kind of experimentation, most people just thought that trees are responding to the environments, and when it's dry, they don't grow as much. But what we're showing is it's also very strong competition for water in the soil, is also limiting tree growth, and that, of course, then limits carbon intake, right? Lianas reduce tree growth. We found that very clearly, and what that leads to over the long time is this massive reduction in carbon uptake. So what we found is that lianas reduced carbon uptake by about 76% per year, which is an enormous amount. And the white bars there are the control plot, but that is the sum of carbon, that's the carbon uptake, which is the sum of lianas and trees, versus the black bars, which is just the tree carbon uptake. But we still found this enormous effect. So we can scale this up to the forest level and say, this is the effect of lianas in the forest, about 75% per year less carbon. Tree reproduction is also dramatically affected. The number of trees with fruits after you cut lianas 2 years after and 5 years after goes up enormously. And the number of species that are fruiting also increases in more or less the same level. Okay, so one of the questions on Wednesday was, are lianas bad for trees? Well, our evidence suggests that they are. But I think a better question would be, are lianas bad for forests? So trees are definitely competing with lianas. But what about the forest? What about thinking about the whole ecosystem? First of all, lianas provide this enormous amount of diversity, which must be important for animal abundance, particular invertebrate abundance. There's so many different specialized species in the tropics that lianas are probably hosting a whole group of specialized invertebrates. And we started to test some of these ideas. So initially I would give these talks, and all this stuff was new. And it turned out that basically what I was telling people was lianas are having this enormously bad effect on tropical forests. So people would say, we need to be careful about lianas. That's what we need to do. So it's not quite that simple. So we started to look at their effects on animal communities. And one of the most abundant animals that we find in tropical forests are ants. So we first started to look at ants. And what we found is that ant species richness increases considerably with lianas. Now, if you're an ant, picture yourself as an ant in the tropical forest. This is what it looks like. You look up and you see every tree is basically an island to a small non-volant, non-flying invertebrate. And so if an ant is living in this tree, for example, and the tree next door is producing fruits or nectar or something that it desires, this ant has to climb all the way down the trunk of the tree, crawl across the forest floor over branches and leaves and hills and anteaters and all sorts of predators, find the next tree and climb all the way up, right? That's not a very attractive ecosystem for an ant, right? And so what happens in these kinds of forests when you don't have lianas is a very aggressive ant species form, having the tree just basically starve. So ants are very good at that. But what lianas do is they link the forest crown together. So there's a lot of connectivity. They're going from one tree to the next. And they basically make the forest canopy a matrix of resources for invertebrates. Here you can see a liana that branches, that's going into multiple tree crowns. So we wanted to experimentally test whether lianas influence invertebrate diversity. And what we found is this: when you cut lianas, you actually get a decrease in invertebrates here, in this case plants, but other invertebrates are found the same way. And then what we did is we added lianas, but they weren't actually lianas, they were old climbing ropes that we connected a bunch of the trees that were climbing ropes to stimulate connectivity in tropical forests, right? And we found this immediate response. Then suddenly diversity goes back up, right? So by connecting the forest together, lianas are actually serving this huge purpose for invertebrates, and they increase invertebrate diversity. Lianas also have a big effect on birds. We'll move to the vertebrates. Lots of birds use lianas as structure for mating and nesting, and also for resources. And so we examined this in this experiment as well. Before the liana removal, the black and white bars are the control, and liana removal are the same. And we did 2 full censuses of the birds. And then when you cut lianas, you actually get this huge decrease in bird abundance. So something's happening there. And if you look at this another way, the bird communities are completely overlapping before cutting lianas. So when you cut lianas, you get this complete separation of the bird community. So what's happening is that certain bird species that rely on lianas suddenly exit the ecosystem, right? Other vertebrates like monkeys rely on lianas especially during the dry season. They seem to change their diet and start relying much more on liana leaves and fruits. And that's because lianas are growing more during the dry season. We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday. And so when they're growing more, they're producing more fruits and producing more young leaves. And a lot of vertebrates suddenly change their diet. Suddenly they're utilizing lianas. So if you cut all the lianas, then we're going to lose a lot of animal species. Of course, lots of animals use lianas to produce the forest, because if you're an arboreal animal, you don't want to go down to the forest floor. It's very dangerous there. Lots of things that can eat you. And so sloths use lianas quite frequently. Anteaters use the lianas. A lot of small vertebrates use lianas, like this beautiful possum. Is that a goya? How do you say it when you tell beautiful bird's mother? The beautiful bird's mother. I love this photo. It's a beautiful animal. It's one of the many possums that are in these tropical forests, and they use lianas to escape predators. Predators, of course, are very smart. They use lianas to attract their prey, like this young ocelot here. Boas are also using lianas to access the canopy. It's very hard to climb a big tree, but lianas are smaller and they are not quite as steep to climb. So there have been papers published that have shown that many birds look for trees that don't have lianas in them because it limits predation by snakes. So we've been trying to get a handle on, I've studied plant communities for the most part, but we're branching out, right, and trying to get a better handle on how animals are affecting. But one of the ways we're doing this is using camera traps that we employ in the forest. And this is a way for us to be able to track the animal use of the forest, what animals are depending on lianas versus trees, and how they're responding. We have a lot of data on this. This is an example, but I won't go into this. I'm going to show you pictures of the animal communities that we're seeing that pass through. And this forest is actually quite remarkable because it has a very intact animal community, like this family of coatamundis that came through, probably looking for seeds and fruits. Vested anteaters are quite common in this forest, even anteaters with This is how they carry their babies on their backs. The babies look just like the adults, they're just small. There's squirrels. No one in North America finds this very interesting because squirrels are everywhere in North America, but squirrels are a big seed predator. There's these things called agoutis. Agoutis are really important in these forests. They're a major seed predator, especially for really. Apparently, they put big spiders in their mouths, and they try a little bit of meat. So we find herons in the forest, which is eating snakes, which is I've never seen this before, but cameras start to catch everything. There's pretty big vertebrate herbivores like deer and peccary, and then of course your friend the possum. And there's also predators. You know, we're finding some pretty big predators like these jaguarundis that walk through the forest, and they're interesting because they you know, when the camera takes a photo, it makes a little noise, makes a little click, and these cats are very curious and they're very interested in what the noise is. So I have a lot of photos of cat faces, which is nice because then you can start to identify when cats come back and are using the same resource and get an idea of how territorial they are. Yes, that's right. That's right. Here's another one, just staring at the camera. You know, probably looking for food. Here's a little ocelot on this side, really beautiful animal, and they seem to be fairly common. And so when you have these kinds of animals, they're changing the behavior of the other animals, the herbivores and the seed predators, right? Because these ones have quite an appetite, and we see them at night, we see them kind of at dusk. And yeah, that's what we're finding. So there's plenty of animals. They seem to be preferring some animals prefer the liana removal plots, and some animals prefer the control plot, but it may depend on season. That's what we're investigating now. So we haven't published that paper yet. This work is, of course, I'm presenting this work, but lots of collaborators were involved. I've had lots of postdocs work on these studies. My graduate students and all of our field technicians who are out in the field every day collecting data are really the ones that do all the heavy lifting. And of course, the National Science Foundation of the US supports all this data, data collection and all these questions. And I will leave you with this beautiful photo of Aristolochia liana. You know, these things are fly pollinated, so they have this maroon green color and smell kind of like rotting flesh. So probably no one's giving you a bouquet of these, but they're really quite stunning to see before. So they're about the size of your face. So thank you very much for your attention. I know it's been a long morning.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I don't know if you, Alfredo,